Good evening, everyone. This is Zach, and I'm here with Tom Spiller. We're here to... Hey, Tom, and I'm going to get to you in just a bit. We're launching this new sort of like PolCast, politics podcast, because obviously there have been some groundbreaking results in the United Kingdom as of the 12th of December, 2019. Tom here is an out-and-out Tory. I myself am a bit of a shy Tory. But beyond just opining, we're here to talk about the results, what happened, what led to what happened, and what the future is going to look like. Obviously, none of us know what the future is going to be like, but guesstimating on where our trends are, and also a bit about the opinions as well. So I think a good place to start, and we're going to be a bit free-flowing as well, so bear with us. I think a good place to start is where were we on the 12th of December, 10 o'clock, when we heard about the exit poll. Tom, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right. I'm an out-and-out Tory. I've got the scars to prove it, both physical in terms of being chased by dogs and people, but also spiritual and psychological. I remember my 2015, where I was when I heard the exit poll. I'd just come back. I'd been up since 4 a.m. that day. I'd been out campaigning all day. I got home round about 9:30. I had to get a snack and then go to a local count. So I was going to be up until 5 a.m. anyway. And I was absolutely beaten up. I felt terrible. I felt like there was going to be a hung parliament. It was going to be an absolute disaster. And as soon as I heard the exit poll saying that the Conservatives, David Cameron, got a majority, me and my friends were just dancing around our kitchen. We had bottles of beer that we opened and sprayed all over the place. It was very euphoric. Contrast that with 2017, where I was expecting a much more euphoric experience, but actually it was just crushing. So basically my plan for polling day in 2019 was to just be at a friend's house. So if it went badly, I could just slink off home and go to sleep. But if it went well, I had the option to sort of go out to all of the many parties that you can imagine happen in London on an election night. And I think I was in a room full of, it was someone's sitting room full of guys in their sort of 30s and 40s, proper grown-up men. The exit poll result was announced, and it was like England had just won the World Cup final. We went absolutely crazy. It was a very sort of teenage moment. It felt pretty good. What about you, man?
So as I was telling you earlier, that I was in an Indian restaurant. No stereotypes there. No, but I was in an Indian restaurant. We were doing a meal for my society campfire, and I'd say I'm probably the most right-wing. Well, I'm not really right-wing, but anyway, I'm a shy Tory. And I was refreshing the Twitter feed every couple of minutes. And then as it got to 9, so I put my phone away and I set my alarm for 10 o'clock because it was just getting to me. And I was just very, very worried about what the results were going to be. And then when I saw that it was an 80-seat prediction. I think it was an 80-seat prediction. I did a dance, and I did a dance in front of the whole restaurant, which was a bit weird. It wasn't really Bhangra, but anyway, it was like my own invention. But it was a bit embarrassing because obviously we're not in the luxury of being in London. We're in Cambridge, where the main battlefield is between Lib Lab. And I think I lost a few brownie points that day. But at the same time, I would rationalize it that I'm not necessarily, technically I'm a member of the party, but because I see from my bank account, I pay £2.99 a month. So I need to kind of sort that out. But anyway, but on a more serious note, I think what I wanted was certainty and clarity. And I think like much of the country, it wasn't necessarily a vote for Boris Johnson or the Tory party, but rather it was just a vote that these parliamentary games about Brexit were getting to the point where you could see, I've done the switch from Wall Street to Main Street, and you could just feel there was a lot of anxiety about what was happening to Parliament, to the leadership, to Brexit as well. So I think, obviously this was the election. Theresa May also talked about it in her speech after the election, that this was the election that 2017 was supposed to be for the Tory party. So maybe we could go and talk about that a bit. What were the mistakes? And Tom, maybe you would have excellent granularity on this, owing to your connections within the party. What were the mistakes of 2017, and what did the Tory party do in 2019, and how confident? So I'm throwing many questions at you, so answer them at your will. And how confident were the internal pollsters about a Conservative victory? So, when you talked about that you were expecting the exit poll, like to what extent were you expecting a hung parliament? To what extent were you actually expecting the Tory party to win?
Yeah. Well, I was expecting, I told everyone, I was expecting a majority of around 15 to 25 for Boris. So not hugely confident, but I knew there was enough in it that would tip it over onto our side. But that's born of paranoia, largely from the scarring effects of 2017, where our expectations were totally wrong. And you're right, it's the same policy platform that we tried in 2017. This idea that Labour voters would stay at home or switch over to the Conservative Party. What made the difference? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, some people say Boris Johnson, as the person who led the Leave campaign, was just that much more credible when he was making that same, giving that same message. One thing, as a tangential point, one thing I found incredibly interesting during the whole campaign this time around was that no one ever referred to the fact that Jeremy Corbyn, maybe we're all in our bubbles, right? But I never saw it. I never saw anyone say this is the leader of the Remain campaign versus the leader of the Leave campaign. I never saw that, which is a feature of Labour's total failure on its strategy of constructive ambiguity when it came to their position on Brexit. And if you look at the polls and you look at the post-election analysis that good people at Ipsos Mori have done, when you see the reasons why people either didn't vote Labour or switched, so they didn't vote at all or they switched to another party. One of them, sure, far and away, was this idea that Jeremy Corbyn was not someone they wanted in Downing Street, but it was also Brexit. It was also the fact that they'd failed to take an established position. Some people thought they weren't Remain enough. Some people thought they weren't Leave enough. So they managed to get peeled like a banana from left and from right. Whereas on that topic, and as you say, there's this huge sense of relief after the election, right? Because people wanted certainty. They wanted some kind of progress. Jeremy Corbyn's constructive ambiguity faced by get Brexit done, he didn't stand a chance.
I heard this really nice quotation that I've been using, that it's easier for the right to move left on economics than it is for the left to move right on identity. And I know that we talk about Brexit, and I know that a lot of people talk about sovereignty, and there are some very mixed opinions about the sovereignty argument, but would you call this to some extent the identity election, where the Great Red Wall sort of crumbled because, finally, and even now Labour's talking about progressive patriotism, that, that the fact of the matter is that the white working class, to some extent, in as much as they agree with left economics, they also have a strong sensitivity about identity, immigration, and so where the Tory party can make strong, and also the Brexit party can make very strong inroads.
It's interesting. I mean, a lot of the narrative from the left, both after the referendum and now after the general election, is people that don't vote for us, who we think we own, are stupid or are racist. It's funny. I spent a lot of time during the campaign speaking to people on the phone, and I was tasked largely with converting Brexit party voters to Tory voters. And it was very, very easy, I have to say, to persuade them to vote Conservative. And I spoke to people in Teesside, I spoke to people in East Anglia, I spoke to people in South London. And it was so easy. You appeal to their sense of duty, abstract, old-fashioned ideas that people who read The Guardian and shop in Waitrose would laugh at, such as, national pride, and, a sense of being part of a national effort. And it really, really worked. It really appealed to them.
Tom, just a quick, sorry to interrupt you, and you can go for it. When you were talking about these voters, what was the demographic? Are they older, white, working class,
I don't know the answer. All I know is their name and their address.
But just if you had to guess.
I prefer not to, because identity politics is not, it's not my thing. You know, British people have the right to vote, and I'll appeal to them on the basis of the policy platform.
Interesting. But then I think, but that's where sort of like, yeah, I can see where you're coming from, but at the same time, I think we are undergoing a very broad, and correct me if I'm wrong, but don't you see this broad realignment where the broad church of the Labour Party is crumbling because it's trying at one go to tie in this demographic in the north, which is now defecting or not voting for it anymore, or going for the Tory party and its proxy party, the Brexit party. And on the other side, you have the London ethnic minorities, in particular, say the Muslim community, that is now becoming staunchly Labour. And we cannot also forget that 60% of the ethnic minorities in this country vote for the Labour Party. So are we seeing what the Republican parties have started to do, which is consolidate the majority vote? And I mean, I don't know if this is something you're happy to talk about, but it's like, for me, when I look at this election, and I agree that, I apologize, maybe I'm looking at it from my own bias as a, you know, as a new Briton, or as a minority Briton, but that's how I would interpret the election. But obviously, you know, you are more versed in these things. So
no, realignment is, you know, the defining political theme of our day, and it's very confusing, right? So you find Tories very proudly drinking in Wetherspoons, and, you know, identifying very solidly with working class people who have this sense of patriotism. The Labour Party has been gentrified effectively, but realignment is a very interesting feature. I mean, you're right. The Conservatives didn't make any progress, didn't win any more votes from minority communities.
But I don't think it has to. By the way, I don't think that, as somebody who's a shy Tory, I think that this is a very, you know, when I am probing you on this, I think that it's not somehow that perhaps I can be a bit less PC than you can be, and I'll probably use this. But I think the problem is that we have, and I don't know, I'm just going to say it out there, but we haven't allowed white people to have pride in their country and their institutions. But at the same time, I think what has happened with the ethnic minority and the left is that we have kind of asked for that for ourselves. And, you know, that's what's costing us, because I live in the Shires, I deal with all segments of society, I'm a small business owner. And what you do see is that there is a feeling among select demographics that I mean, especially this would be the young white male whose career prospects are sort of stymied. And I don't know if you saw the news today in the Times about a donor wanted to install a £1 million scholarship for young white working class children. So the whole idea is that now race has become a very definitive thing, because we are an aging country, we're a transforming country as well. The average age in the United Kingdom is 40. The average age of the young ethnic Briton is younger than that. So Britain is only going to change in certain ways. And I think what has happened in this election, I don't think that there's been a lot of dog whistling by the Tory party, but the Tory party has tapped into some sort of larger widespread resentment about where the majority don't feel that they can express certain viewpoints without being called racist. And, you know, I think that they've expressed their thoughts on the ballot box. And but let's also talk, before we delve a bit deeper into the Labour Party. So Jeremy Corbyn has promised to step down in March, and now there's a Labour leadership in the offing. As a Tory, who would you like to see in the leadership? One is that, who would you like to see a continuation of a Jeremy Corbyn type personality, or do you see the end of the Labour Party and you see a major realignment in that sense, or do you think we are going to have a healthy Labour Party again and a two-party system, so on and so forth? Where are you on that?
I mean, it's interesting. I'm in two minds. So, you know, I joined politics as an idealist. So I would say in a two-party system, which is what we have, people over the years have tried to create fashionable theories saying that we aren't, but we really are. And this result is massive evidence of that. I would always say that the country's best interest to serve when you have two healthy, strong parties in the centre. And we absolutely do not have that with the Labour Party right now. So, in one sense, by all means, if you want to, I see we've got a special guest there in the background, Zach. Yeah, everyone's got opinions, right? So I don't know. On one hand, I want to see a continuity Corbyn candidate, which means that we keep all those Red Bull seats, and potentially make even bigger gains. I mean, one classic example of realignment and how much it is hurting the Labour Party to be so thoroughly gentrified by these metropolitan Guardianistas is Mansfield. So Mansfield is in the East Midlands. It's a seat that used to be, used to have mining communities within it. Labour lost that seat in 2017 because people did not like Jeremy Corbyn and could not identify with this identity that he's pushing as the Labour Party. They lost that seat relatively narrowly. This time, an 18,000 vote majority for the same seat. I mean, it's only going one way. At the end of the day, I think one of the main reasons that people said they couldn't vote Labour or couldn't vote if they were traditional Labour voters was that Jeremy Corbyn and his baggage, effectively, but also Jeremy Corbyn and his policy platform. But I'm telling you now, but yeah, the policy platform as well. So what I'm talking about is being a hard leftist, right? And all of his historical baggage that comes with that. But if you take Jeremy Corbyn, change his skin color, give him a facelift, change his gender, but he's still coming out with the same stuff, you're still going to lose, and we're still going to keep a majority of 80, which...
But then, I don't know, I thought that the 2017 Labour, I mean, I'm obviously following the news flow, but I thought that the 2017 manifesto of Labour was one. So, going back to my point, which is in the 2017 Labour manifesto, which certainly worked far better than, say, the 2017 Conservative manifesto, which had the pension, misfiring on pensions, and it seems very poor leadership. I don't necessarily want to disparage Theresa May, who I think is quite an honourable person and probably one of the most honourable politicians I know, but it seems that the 2017... God almighty, what is wrong? Sorry, buddy. Sorry.
Children and animals. Children and animals. Any minute now, Violet's going to wake up. Our screaming baby to add to the mix. Hey, the kid's got moves. He's got good moves.
He wanted to do a little dance for you. No, I don't know what's going on with him. He always does this when it's busy. So the 2017 Conservative manifesto paled in comparison to the Labour one. And it seems that this manifesto sort of paid a bit of a nod to some of the ideas that emerged within the Labour faction. So the idea is that to some extent the Conservative Party is also moving a bit leftward. Like I think we are looking at the end of austerity as an example. We are looking at support for the welfare state, especially when you talk about seats like Mansfield. I don't think that these are necessarily libertarian voters. And is it just a case that the Tory Party know the libertarians are going to be voting for it? The free marketeers are going to vote for it. The capitalists are going to vote for it. So is it time that they sort of do a reverse Blair and follow David Cameron and continue along this process and actually stake out the center ground to sort of push out these other gentrified parties?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. You talk about the centre ground.
Whatever, like...
Yeah. Well, the face of the Conservative Party is very different now with the new 2019 intake. You really can't. I mean, you will have Jacob Rees-Mogg, but you will also have, Ben Bradley, the guy from Blythe Valley, Danaher in Bishop Auckland. It's Jacob Young in Redcar, who is works in a chemical plant.
And he worked on Christmas Day. Yeah.
What a lad. Didn't want to let his fellow workers down. But it's a very, very different complexion to the party right now. And it's interesting when you talk about Centreground, and there's this big consensus, certainly recently in the press, that we're not in the Centreground anymore. I tell you, Boris Johnson does not have any right-wing credentials. And that could not be more clear from his manifesto, which is all about spending, yes, on infrastructure projects. So it's not the same as a handout, in the way that we characterised the Labour manifesto. But I don't know, it feels very centrist. Ironically, if you want to talk about identity, I think David Cameron was not someone who appealed to these working class voters in the Northeast, but strangely Boris Johnson somehow is.
Are you talking about, isn't he a bit like the British Trump in that sense? That Donald Trump seems to have a sway on middle America, even though he's sort of not necessarily the prototypical politician you'd expect for them.
Yeah. I mean, people are desperate to make comparisons between Trump and Boris, mainly because of the haircut. But also, I think the only comparison in British politics with Trump is Jeremy Corbyn. They even use the same language, the rigged system.
Well, I think that's where the Tory party also needs to be, right? The whole idea is that the Tory party is the oldest political party in the world, and it's the one thing that it is committed to is staying in power and being relevant, right? I mean, that's the whole, and its principles are going to have to adapt. And I think, I mean, I know I've asked you this question, but just to reflect it a bit back onto me, is that I would say that the Labour Party is sort of it needs to figure out, especially with its next leader, as to who it gets onto the platform, is will it remain rigid, and will it remain gentrified, and will it remain wedded to, I think Corbyn's economics were not so much the issue as opposed to his politics. His links to the IRA, Hamas. I mean, alleged links. I don't really want to go into it. The anti-Semitism that is rife within the party. I mean, these are the sort of things that put off voters. I mean, even something as trivial and banal as when the Queen's speech is, perhaps even Boris Johnson wouldn't even know when it's on, right? It's just that his credibility.
I do have to interject on that one. Everyone knows when the Queen's speech is on.
Really?
Everyone knows it's on at 3 p.m. It's just after lunch. That was a lie. I mean, that was just the point that counts against Jeremy Corbyn. There was the failure to be authentic. He could have said, "No, I don't watch it," and his supporters would have loved him for it. But instead, he felt the need to try and find some sort of slippery middle ground answer. And
do you think he actually lost votes on something as trivial as that? I don't know. I mean,
no, but it confirmed people's suspicions about him. And that I think that there's some guys whose data I looked at, and they estimate that 1 million Labour voters in those red wall seats that they lost stayed at home. And I think, I don't know, who knows how many of those people, for whom that was the final straw.
Tom, before we go back, I also want to talk a bit about something that's of quite of importance to the the Tory party, which you guys would need to be thinking about, which is boundary reform. And the fact is that this was something that's been bandied around since the Tories first came into power. Obviously, the disastrous 2017 election, nothing happened because of that. So, obviously now also everything's up in play, because Labour voters are sort of defecting. The very same voters who were sort of like a threat to the Tory party, say, a decade ago, now could be Tory stalwarts. So how does the Tory party approach boundary reform? Is it something that is in its interest or not?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the original proposal that was created after 2 years of work by the Boundary Commission was to redraw the boundary lines so that it was equal and fair. And there were roughly 75,000 voters in every single constituency. But also to reduce the number of seats from 650 to 600. And I think it's quite clear that MPs of all stripes will refuse to vote for that. So the legislation is such that we need to go back to the drawing board and start again. But the principle behind the boundary review is that because the electorate moves around so much these days, that we have equal sized constituencies, which is absolutely, as a matter of fairness, the right principle. I don't think we should take a tactical approach to it personally. But ultimately the rebel seats have lent us their votes. They are not people we can rely on coming back next time, unless the Labour Party continue in this disastrous vein. But
we saw that. It's video, by the way, Tom.
But yeah, it's. I think there's a lot of chat before about reducing the size of Parliament, and that would be a net benefit to the Conservative Party. Well, not now, not if all these seats. So I think that idea, in terms of strategy, but in terms of pragmatic reality as well, is just out the window now.
So just to get back to which of the potential candidates would be a threat on the Labour side, who would be a boon to the Tories? Who would be the next Jeremy Corbyn, as in, really a boon? And who would be a real threat to the Tories? Who do the Tories see right now as sort of like, kryptonite to the party?
That's interesting. So in that analogy, Boris is Superman, not the Incredible Hulk. So it's interesting. I mean, I have been watching it unfold with absolute joy on one hand, because they all continue to make the same mistake. All of the candidates thus far have tried to tread the middle ground in terms of Brexit, in terms of the future of the party, whether or not it wants to stay in this new woke left-wing phase or come back to something a bit more normal. And it's music to my ears, because that's exactly the attempt to be all things to all men that got them where they are today, and long may they stay there. It's far too early to say who would actually be a threat, but at the moment, none of them really. I suppose the Labour Party have succeeded when they were the party of aspiration. It feels like anyone who's too far into the Islington bubble will just not be palatable to the electorate, but will be palatable to the Labour membership.
I find it interesting how, talking to you and talking to somebody who's been quite immersed in the whole thing, but for you, it's still very much about, I feel like your playbook is a bit more, without sounding offensive, but it feels very much from the 90s and the noughties, where we're still talking about economics, and we're still talking about aspiration, and we're still talking about, equality, not inequality, but more like, general prosperity. Whereas I think in the trigonometry video that's been going around with Professor Matt Goodwin, and he talks about how before the 2014 European elections, he gave this is a very, very fascinating thing, that he gave a presentation to both Ed Miliband and to Sir Linton Crosby on the same day, and he talked about how it wasn't necessarily economic insecurity that was threatening to voters, but rather it was a story about values and how identities were being challenged by migration. You talk about internal migration, but obviously external migration.
But I don't know. The important thing that David Cameron realised in 2015, and this is something that will absolutely be in the head of Sir Linton Crosby, is that Britain is not Twitter. I mean, bubbles are very, very real, and it's the reason why so many people were confused by the election result this time, because all they'd seen on social media was, momentum type things.
Yeah.
And hatred towards the Tories, and they couldn't understand how the Tories could get a majority when faced with this sort of Twitter storm. But it makes no difference. I mean, certainly last time I checked, only 7% of the electorate were on Twitter.
7%.
Yeah, exactly. It's as low as that. Where was this mythical youthquake? I was told by someone 2 weeks before the election that millions upon millions upon millions of sort of 18 to 24-year-olds were going to turn up and vote, but they didn't. So I think a lot of people had very strange ideas.
They did in Canterbury. To be fair, the Canterbury seat now is pretty much solidified, from what I can remember.
It's a complicated. I don't know. I mean, we're still having a really good think about what. I mean, there's a guy out there who sort of runs the campaign, and he'll be kicking me for not knowing all the right points to make, but. It's a very complicated map in Canterbury. It's not as simple as saying it's a university town. It's not as simple as saying it's got a big hospital.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting. I think in our conversation, we've kind of gone through a fair bit of where British politics is going. I think there were some things that you were talking to me about anti-Semitism that maybe we should be talking about it on the video as well. That you talked about. Sadiq Khan made a speech about at the Chanukah event, but then you talked about how each of the party leaders and Sadiq had talked about had made a Chanukah speech, and I'll let you explain it in your own words.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's interesting. So this idea that I told you about a little while ago, which is that the first week of a parliament defines really how it will end and how people will vote in the general election. It's because that's when you really set your narrative. I found it very confusing that Labour sent Jeremy Corbyn to do the Chanukah Facebook message. I mean, I just read them, but certainly at the time when I sort of had a look, Boris created a Facebook video which was very widely shared within the Jewish community. It had very quickly 283,000 views and, more importantly, 5,500 shares. It fully went viral within the Jewish community, and people absolutely loved it. By contrast, Jeremy Corbyn at a much higher number of views, 337,000, but only 3,000 shares. And I really wonder what those shares were and what those comments were. I can't believe that they were all positive. That's for sure. The Lib Dem effort, similar, a very small number of views, relatively speaking, only 85 shares. And then Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, 16,000 views, 61 shares. Now, I've just mentioned 4 different political figures that made videos about anti-Semitism. Can you guess how many of them referenced anti-Semitism?
Anti-Semitism in general, or in the Labour Party, or
in general, at all?
I imagine only Bojo must have done it.
Right. So Boris did, the Lib Dems did, and Sadiq Khan did.
Oh,
but Jeremy Corbyn did not mention anti-Semitism, but he did mention the climate change crisis 3 times. Now, that I think was a huge disaster. I mean, there are only 300,000 or roughly Jewish people in this country. It doesn't make a huge difference in terms of the actual voting arithmetic to anything. But this feeling that they still haven't grappled with it and they're still not dealing with it at a time when even Sadiq Khan is referencing it in his Chanukah message, just for me was just a massive mistake. I mean, they could have sent anyone else to do it. They could have got a collection of people to do it. But no, they wanted to stick with Jeremy Corbyn, and that I don't think that's going to do many favours.
Yeah, but perhaps even when you do have that, you will need to see who the candidate is. I mean, Keir Starmer seems to be the candidate of choice for the Blairite wing, at any rate, in the Labour Party. But then I also wanted to talk a bit about, which is of interest to me, FPTP PR. And
I have absolutely no idea what that is, by the way. That's how much of a Tory I am.
First past the post. And
oh, I thought you meant like follow FBPE, like the Remainer tag on.
Oh no, even I don't know what that stands for. Or there's also a Brexiteer tag. No, I meant FPTP and PR.
Oh right, yeah.
And how does the party, for instance, I don't really think that in an election it would necessarily hurt the Tories as much to even switch from FPTP, from first past the post. I mean, this is fundamentally a soft C country. So, in fact, if anything, it's always going to affect Labour a lot more than it would affect, because it would really annihilate the Labour Party, because it would have to go into coalitions with the Greens, with Lib Dems. I mean, Labour would be in a perpetual coalition government, for better or for worse. So I don't know what your thoughts on that would be.
I don't know. There's a lot of confusion over our electoral system, particularly in people that don't like it. So you remember when we had the referendum and we got a result they didn't like, and they said, no, referendums are a disaster, never use them. And then within a year, they'd become all about referendums. That's the only vote they wanted, a second referendum on Brexit. I think, they wanted to avoid a general election, and now they've got one. I mean, there is not, electoral reform is not on the cards.
I think not for the next 5 years, at any rate.
Well, I don't know. I don't see a strong case for it. I mean, you're absolutely right. Proportional representation is something that creates a perpetual system of coalitions. And that necessarily hands power to the party machinery and the politicians, rather than, the individual sort of leader or the people in their cabinet. Because how is someone in a government of 6 different parties where deals have to be struck on a daily basis, how is that person accountable for the results of that government's actions? It's a lot more abstract, and I don't think that cures any problem. I don't think people look at PR, certainly not people who look at it in detail and think, yeah, that's for me, that's going to solve the problems that we've got in this country.
Yeah, I think that this election, I mean, I don't want to sound too optimistic, but it seems to have been a bit of a magic bullet for the Tory party, because at one go it sort of corrects all of Cameron's penchant for referendums, because once we Brexit on the 31st of January, we start the process, and Scotland's dragged out of Europe along with the rest of Britain. That sort of essentially puts paid to Scottish independence. I think the Northern Ireland furor is I don't think we'll be seeing a united Ireland anytime soon. Because again, at the end of the day, for Scotland and Northern Ireland, the question of currency is going to be a very problematic one for their referendum. So Britain seems to be in I mean, I don't want to sound too optimistic, but Britain seems to be going into a very golden age. And I think it's really, as always, the worst enemy of the Tory party is itself. And the whole idea is that if it does renege on its social compact, I don't think anyone in the country would forgive it. So I do appreciate the message. I mean, this is a bit of a personal note, but I'd say I do appreciate the message that these are borrowed voters. And I think, in as much as I enjoy Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I enjoy the old foggies of the party, the idea is that this country is still fundamentally very invested in its social compact and the welfare state, and people want to see the NHS cordoned off, privatized. The idea is that I don't think this country has moved right on economics, and I think that's where you and I are sort of disagreeing with. Probably it is mellowed by the fact that I live in Cambridge and I don't want a mob after me. But I do also see that anybody who votes for the Tory party is not voting for continued austerity, is not voting for sort of the decimation of the NHS. So, and what is interesting, I'll just share a few facts because I've been going through this. And interestingly enough, if you had GCSE or lower, you broke for the Tories 58% to 25%. If you had a medium education, which is defined as A levels, you still broke for the Tories 48 to 31. It's only if you had a high education, which is a degree and above, you broke for the Labour Party, which is 43 to 29. And interestingly enough, obviously across all income levels, there was a majority of plus 40% for the Tory party. But I'm surprised by the fact that if you earned greater than £70,000 in this country, you still, even though you still broke for the Tory party, 31% of that demographic voted for Labour. So you do see a lot of, to paraphrase an earlier term, virtue signalers who are, I don't want to be characterizing an entire demographic that way, but people who are so keen to sort of demonstrate their wokeness, even at the cost of their own personal prosperity. And all social classes from A, B to DE broke for the Tory party, which is expected. And I think what is very, very interesting is 18 to 24-year-old women are the highest Labour voters in this country at 65%. And as I said earlier, the average age of the UK is 40. Anyone below 40 broke for the Labour Party. Anyone who was older than 40, from 40 to 70 plus, broke for the Tory party. So it is, and what people forget as well is that it isn't going to be a great die-off. It just so happens that as the voter turnout is correlated with age, so you have voter turnout exceptionally low among the younger classes. And I have had a lot of friends, sorry, I'm meandering a bit, but who have talked about, but what happens in 30 or 40 years when these young voters become 40, 50, 60-year-olds. We're already old before our time, obviously, Tom.